Hello everybody. Today we are going to discuss and learn about women's participation in public life. Here we will be focusing on two areas. One, women's participation in politics, and two, women's participation in wage earning workforce. Now, let's begin with some facts and figures. Let's see how women's representation in executive government positions look like. Globally, 31 countries have 34 women as heads of state and/or government, and only 22.8% cabinet members heading ministries are women. And in only 13 countries, about 50% or more of the positions of cabinet ministers are held by women. And women and gender equality, family and children affairs, social inclusion and development, social protection and social security, and indigenous and minority affairs are the 5 most commonly held portfolios by women cabinet ministers. And women in national parliaments also seem slow. However, some changes have been observed regarding women's representation in national parliaments. Though women's representation in the parliaments is still very low, it has increased by 15.5 percentage points from 11% in 1995 to 26.6% in 2023. And only 6 countries have 50% more women parliamentarians in single or lower houses, and 23 countries have exceeded 40% representation of women in parliament. And 34% women constitute elected members in local governments among 136 countries. A women's representation in local government is slightly higher than in upper levels. %50 in only 2 countries and more than 40% in 20 countries have elected women in local government, and the wide variations across regions are noted. As you can see in the slides, the regions where there are higher and the highest and the lowest representation of women at the local level. And what does the data mean? The data shows that women's participation in politics have increased, but they are still underrepresented. This course has identified the following 5 key factors, which are called 5 C's that prevent women from entering into political field. The first one is confidence. Women's learned behavior and ascribed roles, do's and don'ts, hinder their self-confidence to engage in public life. And candidate selection is the next reason. Political parties, which are often governed and run by men, are not favorable for women to be selected for candidacy. Women who are traditionally engaged in this kind of business has to compete for candidacy. The quota system for women candidacy also, on one hand, creates competition, and on the other hand, decision makers give priority to women related to influential men of the party. Third one is culture. The culture that tend to view women as inferior to men and view that women's place is inside the house and family is their business prevent them from entering into politics. Such conditioning makes them difficult to take on non-traditional roles like political participation. And fourth one is care, which means caregivers' role that women have to perform for old and for young, as they are the ones expected to perform such roles, also prevent them from engaging in public life like politics and employment. Cash. The vicious circle, that is women's expected roles and lack of opportunity to earn because of the expected roles and obligations, leave them with no to little financial resources. But to engage in politics and campaign in election requires money which most women cannot manage. But still it matters. But why does it matter? Women's representation in politics. Why does it matter? Before we discuss about the reasons why women should be in politics or why women should enter into politics, let's discuss first about why women's representation in politics is important. I will draw key points from the discussion and share with you before delivering the topic. I will link the key points drawn from the discussion with the delivery of the topics. Now, let's discuss about women's representation in politics. Now, after the completion of the discussion, now we look into the arguments. There are few arguments, mainly two arguments. We'll discuss about two arguments: justice and utility. Justice and utility have been presented to justify importance of women's representation in political field by Paxton, Hughes, and Barnes. Justice argument. What does it mean? Foremost, women's representation in political life matters for gender equality and democracy. Democracy is participation of all citizens irrespective of gender, social, or linguistic backgrounds. Women's presence in politics is also important to strongly draw attention and seek commitment of lawmakers towards women's issues. If women are in decision-making position, women's issues get more attention through women's own voices. Therefore, it is necessary that women's presence is increased in politics. If there are many women at different levels of the government, it will help facilitate women's engagement in public decision-making, thereby help enhance political accountability to women. However, only the increment in women's representation in quantitative terms does not always work for the betterment of women. Gender sensitivity or gender sensitive governance reforms is more important for effective performance of elective official to promote gender equality. Moreover, people's participation at all levels of political structure and governance is necessary for a country to be called truly democratic. It is also an indicator of equality. Therefore, capability and effective participation of women in decision making is crucial. If not, half of the population would be missing in the development process. Now, let's look into utility argument. The utility argument refers to the usefulness of increased representation of women in politics. Women's presence brings diverse worldviews and experiences, different ways of seeing and knowing, which eventually enriches the decision and the discussion. Increased women's presence in politics also serve as inspiration and role model for young girls and their parents. More young women are likely to prepare themselves for leadership roles if they see more women in such roles. This practice will help create an environment for girls to enhance their self-confidence, self-dignity, and thereby increased opportunities and access to resources, which are important elements of gender equality. Having said this, now let's again engage in a small activities. Now we'll watch the following short videos new to video. After watching the videos, you will break up into groups of 3 and discuss basically 2 points. What we gathered from this video, and as women and men of certain social contexts, how do you evaluate your position with regard to advocating for gender equality in your respective institutions and or communities. After completion of the activity, now we will discuss about participation or representation. Representation. What does representation mean? How does it look like? Justice argument that I talked about earlier suggests that men and women should be equally represented in politics. What does equal representation mean then? Paxton, Hughes, and Barnes argue that equal representation falls into one of the 3 categories of representation, which are formal representation, descriptive representation, and substantive representation. Then, what does formal representation mean? Formal representation refers to the legal right to political participation on an equal basis with men. For example, equal rights granted by law of a nation for women and men to engage in politics or to run for election. Now, descriptive representation. Descriptive representation refers to the match between population size and representation in elected bodies. For example, if women make up 50% of the population, there should be 50% in executive bodies as well. Now, let's look at substantive representation. Substantive representation refers to the qualitative representation. While women's representation is important, creating a feeling of being fairly and effectively represented is even more important. Women are not a homogeneous group. Therefore, although women's representation in politics make other women feel that they are represented, some authors raise a very pertinent issue that whether the women representatives actually represent all types of women. Now, so how can women's representation in politics can be increased? Several mechanisms are in use to promote women's representation in politics. Some authors have grouped those mechanisms into 2 categories, incremental and fast-track approach. Education for women, facilities to help women participate in public life and to organize discussion, dialogue with political parties and male political leaders to prepare and to facilitate women to participate in politics come under incremental approach. Whereas mandate political parties to ensure certain number of or percentage of women for candidacy through legislature fall under fast track approach. It means setting quotas, certain percentage for women's candidacy as mandatory. These approaches are explained by authors in detail through for example, incremental track. Equal representation may take many decades but will be achieved in due course as the country develops. This is the perception of incremental track. And the perception of fast track is women's representation doesn't increase by some historical necessity. Backlash may even be possible. Historical leaps in women's representations are necessary and possible. Now again, let's do some activities. Here is a video, a short YouTube video where Kamla Bhasin, a very well-known Indian feminist, talks about feminism. After watching this 29-minute long talk, if you are in a virtual classroom, you will use Padlet to answer the following 3 questions. If you are in a physical classroom, please use your notebook to write the responses. Those 3 questions are: do you agree with Kamla Bhasin? What was striking in her speech? What do you think should have been differently said? Now, let's listen to the video. This part of the lesson focuses on women's participation in labor market. We'll explore how women's participation in economic activities has changed and in what way kind of jobs women are more concentrated in, and how this change has affected their lives. But before looking into women's participation in labor force, let's begin the lesson by experience or observation sharing session. 2 of you, a lady and a gentleman, are requested to share your observations regarding women's participation in paid and unpaid work in your context or country. Each of you will get 5 minutes. After you finish your presentation in 5 minutes, you're sharing. For another 15 minutes, floor will be open for discussion based on your colleagues' deliberations. All of you are expected to participate in the discussion. If we ran out of time, please use chat box to share your opinion if you are in virtual class. Thank you. And your teacher or facilitator will summarize the discussion and wrap up this session in 5 minutes. Before looking at the global trend in women's participation in labor force, let's look at their education status. Women's participation in public life, particularly their engagement in employment, is very much linked with their education status. Thus, education plays a crucial role in women and girls' social and economic empowerment. However, many girls across the globe still miss educational opportunities. Link between development indicators and education. So why does education matters? There is a link between education and employment. Education matters to both boys and girls. Impacts of education are the same on both boys and girls' lives. However, impact of educating girls is much higher than that of boys. Research shows that girls' education has link with many other development indicators, such as child marriage and childbearing, earnings and standards of living, fertility and population growth, health, nutrition and well-being, agency and decision making, social capital and instruction, and potential economic cost. That means consequences of girls' low access to and low attainment of education is low earning in their adulthood, and this is a loss of potential human capital wealth. The loss in human capital wealth at present is the consequence of not getting benefit of education by adult women in their young age. This means girls' education from very early age is very important. All of these are listed here, and you can read this later. Now again, we'll do a short activity. Before exploring women's participation in labor force or labor market, let's have a brief discussion on association of women's education and their engagement in labor market in your context. Two of you, excluding the previous speaker, will do a 5 minutes presentation. We'll spend another 15 minutes for question and answer and experience sharing, and the teacher will wrap up the session. Women's participation in labor force. Females' participation in labor force has remained unchanged. It hasn't changed over the last 3 decades, and at present, approximately half of the working age women participate in labor force. And gender gap in labor force participation is more prominent in South Asia region and in the Middle East and North Africa, with men's participation rate more than 3 times higher than that of women. Women's participation in labor force was 47.4, whereas men's participation was 72.3. Gender gap in labor force participation is huge in lower middle income countries as opposed to high income countries. Workers with only basic level of education and women had lower chances of getting employment. And this situation became worse during COVID-19 pandemic. Disparity in labor force participation heightened during COVID-19 pandemic. A survey conducted in 40 countries revealed that age and education factors were less prominent than gender on work stoppage trend during pandemic. So this means during COVID-19 pandemic, more women stopped working than men because the children didn't have school, they were at home, so they had to stay home and look after the children. Now we'll again do a short refresher activity. Let's listen to a short interview about women's participation in labor force. The title of the interview is Increasing Female Labor Force Participation, Gender Strategy, Thematic Notes in Interview Series. Now let's briefly talk about workplace well-being. Although improvements were observed, women still experienced a number of critical issues related to well-being that have either not improved or in some cases worsened in the workplace. Now, let's talk about the type of employment that women are engaged in. The type of employment, the work that women are engaged in are categorized in two broad areas. One, vulnerable work, that is on or off the farm, worker in household economic or income activity, and another one is wage work, that is private, public, formal or informal sectors. And gender gap is more prominent where vulnerable work is high. It means where the vulnerable work is more available, and gender gap is more prominent in that area. Low and middle income countries from sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, more vulnerable work. It means low and middle income countries from Sahara Africa and South Asia had more vulnerable work and thus had high gender disparity and more working women in more vulnerable works than working men. So regarding gender gap in vulnerable work, reverse was the case in Europe and Central Asia, which means more men were engaged in vulnerable work than women in Europe and Central Asia. Now, having said this, I have listed, here are the list of the materials that you can study for further information and understanding.